Late 19th century Europe was hungry. Demand for luxury items and new industrial technologies spiked. Societies that considered themselves refined suddenly wanted ornamental carving, piano keys, and eventually pneumatic tires for bicycles. To feed that manufacturing boom, European markets required massive, uninterrupted streams of raw materials. Two of the most valuable were ivory and wild rubber, and Central Africa had both in abundance. Enter King Leopold II of Belgium. He pitched his involvement in the Congo River Basin as a humanitarian crusade. He spoke the language of moral uplift, anti-slavery, and development, presenting himself as a generous benefactor bringing civilization to a dark continent. Following the 1885 Berlin Conference, Leopold achieved something unique in the history of property. The Congo Free State became his personal, private possession, a massive stretch of Central Africa owned and operated by a single European monarch rather than a national parliament. By wrapping his private land grab in missionary language, Leopold built an incredibly effective corporate cover. He engineered an extraction machine that drained immense wealth from the territory, funneled straight into European capitals, while polite society applauded the progress. Operating a private territory of that scale was incredibly expensive. To pull those resources out of the deep interior, Leopold's regime had to recruit armed men, crush local resistance, and lay thousands of miles of railway through difficult terrain. Take a look at this balance sheet. You see massive spikes for infrastructure and astronomical returns in profit. But if you look at the labor column, there is a glaring, blinking zero. The state was not paying anything close to the true cost of the labor required to harvest the ivory and rubber. In economic history, profit margins this extreme rarely come from brilliant innovation. They occur when a specific group of people is deliberately kept entirely outside the protections of contract law, stripped of bargaining power, and forced to work for free. The cracks in Leopold's business model were eventually spotted by a man named Edmond Denis Morel. Working as a shipping clerk at a British firm, Morel had direct access to the trade logs documenting exactly what was moving between Europe and the Congo. He noticed a staggering volume of highly valuable commodities pouring out of the African continent. Tons of ivory and rubber were arriving at European docks, generating massive revenue. This map illustrates the discrepancy he found. A healthy commercial exchange would show valuable raw materials flowing north, matched by an equal flow of currency or trade goods flowing south to pay the producers. But Morel saw nothing of the sort. The ships heading back to the Congo were virtually empty of standard commercial payment. Instead, he tracked a heavy, documented movement of firearms and ammunition heading straight into Leopold's territory. The ledgers painted a grim picture. If valuable goods were leaving and no wages or commercial goods were going back in to pay for them, then force was filling the gap. Bullets and rifles were the currency being used to extract the wealth. That simple accounting reality punctured the philanthropic myth. The numbers proved that the administration used organized violence as a direct substitute for capital investment. To meet the surging global demand for industrial rubber, the Congo Free State abandoned any pretense of a normal labor market. Villages were assigned strict, mandatory rubber quotas by private concession companies. To enforce those quotas, the regime relied on the force publique. Their organized ranks represent a systematic, state-sponsored militarization. This private army existed to impose order and ensure total compliance through a rigid chain of command. When local populations naturally refused to work for free, the administration bypassed bargaining entirely. Soldiers would take women and children hostage, holding them in camps to force the men deep into the forests to gather wild rubber vine sap. The physical evidence of this system was horrifying. The severing of hands became a brutal administrative metric. Soldiers were ordered to produce amputated hands to prove they had not wasted their imported ammunition on hunting, turning mutilation into a standard tool for auditing productivity. Activists, missionaries, and investigators like Roger Casement eventually gathered the testimonies and photographs, bringing these practices to light. What was supposed to be a quiet corporate secret erupted into an international diplomatic scandal. These atrocities were not a breakdown of Leopold's management. Without forced labor, the massive profits would have vanished. Systemic terror was a deliberately chosen efficiency tool designed to lower labor costs to zero and maximize extraction. By 1908, the international pressure became too intense to ignore. The diplomatic fallout forced King Leopold to surrender his private domain, and the territory was officially annexed by the Belgian government. This transition is often recorded as a reform, but the underlying economic logic remained intact. The explicit violence of the rubber terror decreased, and the administrative vocabulary softened, yet the architecture of extraction endured. Wealth continued to flow outward, while control remained strictly in European hands. Over the following decades, the basic extraction model simply updated its inventory. Instead of gathering wild rubber from the forest, the focus shifted to massive, industrial-scale mining. Vast open pits were carved into the Katanga region to remove immensely valuable copper, cobalt, and eventually uranium. The Congo shows how an empire can pivot. It moved from a private, violent fiefdom to a polite, formal colonial administration. The commodities changed, the institutions matured, but the primary function of local labor remained exactly the same: to generate enormous capital for someone else's balance sheet. Today, the specific materials have changed. We no longer demand ivory piano keys. We demand the cobalt and copper that power electric vehicles and smartphones. But the mechanics of securing those resources are alarmingly familiar. Modern supply chains rely on geographic distance to separate the consumer from the site of extraction. Multinationals operate in regions where labor laws are weak or non-existent, ensuring that the wealthy end user never has to see the conditions required to keep consumer prices low. This reveals a harsh reality about how large-scale wealth is often generated. The biggest fortunes are rarely made by creating fair value inside transparent markets. They are built by capturing choke points, controlling the land, the labor, and the law, so that the people producing the value have absolutely no ability to refuse the terms. The history of the Congo Free State serves as an extreme case study of a broader pattern. It shows a business model that flawlessly converts human beings into raw inputs, strips an environment bare, and manages to sell the entire process to the world as progress.